Yeah, Roger, I wanted to know when you use the term risk and harm, did you mean the same thing or are they different?
No. The orthodox view of risk is to take into account the notion of harm, but then you add to it either the sort of probability of the magnitude and also the magnitude of this particular harm. So, so harm, either your unwanted event may or may not occur, and then often on top of that, you have things like the statistical expectation of that
So it's a
wanted event.
probability estimate, right? Risk is a probability estimate?
In the typical notion, the technical notion in clinical trials is often in that sense, yeah. So it's the parallel with efficacy in the clinical trials, yes. But the point would say that these notions go far enough if you just subscribing into a view that all you're looking at is for a favorable, right, ratio, that in no ways can save trial participants from notion of exploitation, which I say that just rationalizing in terms of the expected utility, right? It doesn't say anything about how the rules, right, the particular rules guide the experiment. And one dimension to that is the distribution of these risks and potential benefits, right? Who's deciding on these things? And if you take the view that these experiments, human beings who are going through these experiments are the experiments, right? They should have a voice on it. But again, that only takes you so far because it's not only about they see as favorable outcome, but you also have this notion of like, where are these participants coming from? So my view claim that if you understand clinical trials as public experiments, they're trying to learn something new about the world, and an important piece of knowledge that is supposed to be generalized to a particular population, the population from which these trial participants are coming from, then you have to take that into account, into your model, into your notion of risk, trial participant taking a risk in that experiment.
So sometimes when your participants themselves still want to be part of the study, you'd stop the study, right, from your expanded notion?
Oh, no, not at all. So that's one of the interesting things that I think come out of this framework is that it allows for space like sociologists of scientists, like for example Epstein, that wants to claim that
Right.
during the HIV/AIDS activism in the 80s in the States, there was a shift in discourse where the AIDS activism was able to argue both from an epistemic and ethical sense that, hey, listen, let's not apply a paternalistic model to these experiments. They're of great value to us. You know, the clock is ticking, we're dying, we don't have any medicine. And participating in these trials
These are only
is a
chance.
right,
Yeah.
and I should be able to participate in them.
Okay.
So, and
But what if the result, the outcome of the experiment is not generalizable to the population? What if your population is a very underrepresented population? What do you do then?
well, you always run that risk, right? So you run the risk of not generalizing it accordingly. But to the best of your ability, you're trying to. These are epistemic considerations, right? So whether you tune the study enough, so that and there are arguments about the randomization of these subjects and so forth. But that's sort of a slightly different. They're related, but I think they're different sort of. Thanks for the question.
Just a quick follow-up on, I was struck by your characterization of clinical trials as public experiments, and I don't know enough about them to argue otherwise. But it strikes me if it's a drug company that's organizing a trial, what are the requirements to report research results? Number one, I mean, don't they own the results? And so doesn't that make it a private experiment?
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about this for, I mean, it opens an interesting can of worms there. I mean, there are all sorts of interesting issues. I mean, if you take the view that science is a public affair, right, so the generalizability of this knowledge has to be, there's a sense in which there's an important justification for the nature of these experiments, because you're dealing with human beings, right? Human beings don't belong to anyone. I mean, companies don't, so, and so justifiability of the study has to be open to the public. So yes, there's a sense in which that there are some aspects of the knowledge, the data, it's private. But if you are putting the drug to the market, so you got to go through the jurisdiction of that particular market. So you go through, the FDA and get approval accordingly. Also publish your results in certain journals and so forth. It's that accountability that I think it's an important, and I haven't had a chance to talk about this today. It's a topic of great interest to me, but is in that vein that the justification has to be public somehow. So if there is someone who wants to challenge the ruling of that particular case, this justification has to be public. So not so much as I think I can go this far.
Just a very quick follow-up. I heard recently that women's medicines tend to be overprescribed because the average research subject is a male. And so I think that goes to the heart of the issue of how representative and therefore how public it is. So if the public is defined, I mean, are we going back to Habermas's public, which is the kind of white upper class European male that somehow becomes the normative? Or is it something you deal with in your research? It struck me. I heard that on NPR like a week ago. Somebody was discussing a book and saying women react very strangely to some medicines because they have less body mass than men typically, and the dosage is for the average male. I'm wondering if that's relevant at all to
It is certainly relevant, absolutely. So it's going to be a little bit more complicated, the story about what is this population, right, that we are generalizing this knowledge to at the end of the day. I think this was, particularly, I think Epstein does a good job explaining, for example, the tension that this caused back in the 80s, where not only women were underrepresented, African Americans were underrepresented. I mean, some of the notions weren't really biologically relevant. Nonetheless, in terms of becoming, representative members of the trial, being able to participate in them, there wasn't a representation. And so I think it was only through activism, in this particular case about HIV/AIDS drugs, it was only through a unified voice and demanding their ability to participate in these studies that things started to change, and you see more women, participating in the studies, and they learning more about, well, this doesn't work so well under this subclass population and so forth. But it is a complicated matter. Yeah, I mean, but I have some more things to say too. But yeah, thank you for the questions. Yeah, yes.
I had not so much a question, just was hoping for Mustafa to expand a little bit and clarify one relationship, because you had a really great diagram. Us as media scholars loved the little circle of representation and identity, and I'm actually forgetting your third term, maybe action.
Interests?
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. And then your conclusions had to do not so much with representation, but with violence. So I was just hoping you could clarify that link.
Yeah. Basically, framing the concept that we use in social sciences, how we do see the world, is about representation. So how do you represent your social cultural reforms? How Kurds would understand them? That's the real point. Instead of addressing the economic or cultural or social issues, it is both addressing these issues and making sure that they do understand these clear messages and this is really about representation, and that's what I feel about the disengagement of the European Union discourse and the outcome the government faced in past years, because government, I guess, or these officials, they didn't understand that their discourse is not truly understood by the Kurds in the field. Because when I'm in the field, I'm talking to these people, and they are telling me at times that if PKK didn't exist, such a terrorist violent organization, right? If it didn't exist, their rights would not be recognized at all. This issue would not be on the table at all. So in that sense, you are making, of course, a great mistake by, not hearing these voices and, just focusing on your discourse that this is a terrorist organization. It is not legitimate even, okay, you can have such a discourse, but you need to understand that, you need to win hearts and minds, and you need to understand these people and the framing, competing frames in the field. And that is, I guess, as far as I understand, it is really connected to Dr. Crady's, representation somehow, because, frames are always, these things are socially constructed and mediated. So, so that's my take. Yeah.
Thank you. That's great.
Thank you.
I actually have a question, if that's okay, or a comment for Roger. I come from the background of public health, and you were saying that the people who enroll in clinical trials, they're taking a risk, but I think that not only they're the ones taking the risk, but the whole general population is taking a risk, because they're making assumptions about a drug that is going to work for the whole population on a sample. They're testing 15,000 people, and this drug is going to be taken by millions of people. I mean, so aren't we all taking a risk? Isn't it unfair to everyone? And their populations are now in China, in South America. I mean, they cannot be applied to everyone. Yes?
Yeah. So, I mean, are we all taking a risk? I mean, it's a little harder argument to make. There's some room for that. I mean, what you have to look a little bit more on the particular type of drug you're dealing with, the particular type of disease. I mean, so for example, part of the rhetoric here is that why do they go to Africa? I mean, it's like there's an epidemic there. It's out of control, and it's fairly easy to get people in these studies because there's so many of HIV positive people, right? I mean, so you could come in. And so the dimension of the problem is different than if you're dealing with a very small group, very small population that obviously need a particular medicine, need a particular drug. And the state of the science for that particular type of regimen, is the sort of thing where if you participate in a study, right, you're committed to that drug for the rest of your life. There isn't, you can't switch to a different regimen. So let's say 5 years down the road, a better drug comes out, you're out of luck. So this is a sort of a similar problem that happened with HIV/AIDS in the 80s, right? So there was this problem about, so what do we do? I mean, so clinical researchers wanted this notion of a clean patient, someone who hasn't been exposed to any kind of medicine in some ways, right? So here's a way that you can frame and think about the population of like clean patients in some ways. And so as part of the activism was to think that, no, listen, I mean, at the end of the day, you're going to be generalizing to people that are in all sorts of drugs and people that will be switching to regimens. So there is no such thing as a clean patient, so to comply with your gold standard of evaluating and being able to answer the scientific question you want. So you got to open this to those who have switched regimens, they are taking regimens, they are sharing their drugs and so forth. And otherwise, we're going to jeopardize your study to find a way. So it's a balance there. I mean, where does this sort of boundary of population really, I mean, these are hard questions, but this is a sort of a question that I think we ought to be thinking a bit of. This is where I like to see the conversation going, right? So what are we really learning with this drug, right? Who are we really serving? What is the generalizability? Who are we aiming to serve at the end of the day? Just basically shareholders. I mean, it's like, you know, but I'm not sure if I fully address. It's a tough question, Monica, but I think that's the way to think about it. I mean, so.
I have a naive question. What is the ultimate hoped for outcome of the dialogue about what risk is and who is affected by it? Are we talking about things such as the National Institute of Health or who is allowed to, when you put in you know, like here at the university, if you're going to put in a form that says, okay, I can do the research or I can't do the research, is that the ultimate idea here? Or I'm not clear about what the ultimate outcome is of, or desired outcome is for this dialogue.
Okay, well, that's a general, and perhaps I'm going to let some, no, Kevin, would you like to take a stand? And I'll get back to it. Yeah, well, if it's for in the particular context of like drug research, right? I mean, so what is a proper outcome of a notion? I mean, what do we want from a notion of risk? Is that basically, can I summarize? I mean, is that what we want? How do we? So, question. My take was to say that it needs to be a sort of notion where you want to have room to say that some risks are justifiable, some aren't. So it has to be a sort of a more than just purely a descriptive notion, whatever risk is. So it doesn't reduce to a notion of harm and probability as it often seems to be the case, right? It has to be it has to have normative force to it. And having a normative force is to say that it has to give you room for this discourse of when is it justifiable and when isn't, which takes us to, you know, to a notion of risk that goes beyond its sort of descriptive term. So if you can't reduce it to technicalities of the physical world, right? I mean, sort of the measurable dimension. But it has to play a role in our moral discourse, because risk is a risk, obviously not only to human beings, but when it comes to the domain of the development of drugs, where trial participants are used as vehicles for answering the questions we're posing, this dimension of moral discourse has to be in place, has to coexist with whatever we hope to have as a notion of risk. So a notion of risk is not simply scientific, it's not simply technical, but it has to have this sort of moral dimension to it. And so in that sense, it has to be a normative notion of risk. Does that help? I mean, it's as close as I can get.
This is a big philosophical segment of the discussion. Right?
Yeah, I got. Maybe Kevin, would you like to say something about that? Yeah.
I want to apply this question
Yeah.
of trials conducted in Africa
Yeah.
for a public benefiting, let's say, in North America, to the Enron question, right?
Good.
I mean, one of the most interesting aspects of Beck's work is the notion that that risk recognizes no border. That there are kinds of the risks produced by modernity recognize no borders, right? Which means that Enron, in many ways, should technically be grappling with the same ethical issues. That they're really not only accountable to the American public, but technically to a global public. And that, I think, reintroduces the notion of the state and what role the state might have in issues of risk. So the US, for instance, refused to sign the Kyoto Protocol, right? While countries that might be affected by Enron have. And so to what extent then can we argue normatively for realigning, states' responsibilities with corporate responsibility if they are both to be held accountable not only to national publics, but to some nebulous, kind of borderless humanity?
That's a great question. It was beyond the scope of this paper, but in reference specifically to Enron, to talk about risk, the 90s when the Clinton administration came in was actually a moment of great political risk for the company. They had been accustomed to a particularly cozy relationship with the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, and they had no clue what to expect. In terms of sort of making their own lives easier, they found that they couldn't sort of engage with the Clinton administration on issues of the environment. So there's this interplay going on with the state and the business. The state had interests in sort of promoting sustainable development, combating climate change, and so forth. And as much as Enron sought things that would sort of benefit itself, there's also this sort of the way in which it interacts with the state set the terms for it. For example, I referenced the solar activities Enron was involved in. At one point, the Clinton administration's energy department wanted to turn over the Nevada nuclear test site into a massive solar field. The government would be the guaranteed customer for the power generation there. And the idea was, over time, and Enron won the bid to sort of develop this, and sort of is typical of Enron, they never did, sort of demonstrate that photovoltaic cells, the sort of solar energy panel cells, could be, were commercially viable. So the state actually plays quite a role in sort of setting the terms of sort of economic activity. That's sort of a basic sort of political economic thing going on there. Where I think it gets dangerous with this sort of cosmopolitan ideal, I mean, I agree with you. This idea, the risks themselves don't respect borders. And businesses, whether it's through finance or industrial production, that's absolutely a part of that. When I was thinking about Beck, I also started thinking about William Leach's book, Country of Exiles, in which he talks about this idea of a cosmopolitan corporation that becomes just sort of a way to kind of eradicate local spaces and so forth. And I think there's a certain amount of sort of truth and sort of risk in letting a corporation assume this sort of global sense of responsibility. Ultimately, what happens is sort of its commitments become far more diffuse. And when you have it sort of much more connected to specific states directing actions that might have global implications. You said the U.S. didn't sign the Kyoto Treaty. Enron was actually lobbying the U.S. to sign the Kyoto Treaty. So because it would have benefited its business. But it's that interaction between nation-state level and the corporation, I think, is where that sort of productive tension actually kind of takes place. Even if it's much more sort of, it's certainly not as sort of utopian as the sort of cosmopolitan vision.
I have two questions, first to Roger and then to Mustafa. Roger, I was wondering if I could give you an argument to respond to Monica's question, because
Yeah.
when you generalize from one population, in the case of drug development, to a very distant population, your correlation data is not the only thing you have. You have to have some fundamental understanding of physiology and the biochemical processes, and also at the level of the genes. It is only with those theoretical models in hand that the correlation data becomes generalizable. Otherwise, there is never enough warrant for us to go to another population and say the drugs that I developed with respect to this population will work for you guys.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. You're saying that
Statistics is never enough. We have to have some kind of fundamental understanding of the world before statistics could be useful.
oh yeah, so yeah, I mean, there's nothing that I said here that is in disagreement with that. So I think, but I think you're right in pointing out that this whatever this ethical permissibility of these experiments, right? So for us to be comfortable with the justifiability of these experiments, that we better be, to the extent we can, that our science and our epistemic constraints are in order. I mean, they are
Yeah.
really playing the role they're supposed to play. The randomization is really playing its role, that is really selecting a sample that is supposed to be representative of the population we've agreed on and we are aiming
Yeah,
at
because if we
generalizing.
didn't have that,
So, yeah, that all needs to be in place. There's no doubt about it. But there's this other, so there's this other aspect of the moral dimension, natural dimension, that is the accountability. So, right. So, just having the epistemic dimension in order it's not going to do us anything, right? Because, and so it also raises questions. How do we communicate? Some of it say, this is like complicated stuff. I mean, who understands randomization? The statistics is so, you got to be an expert in some ways to be able to assess what these things are proper. And, the important things are ways of communicating. So people still understand what really matters to them or not. What are the long-term possible side effects of this drug? And if you're given a choice of like, we can stop the study right now because it seems like there is some evidence that suggests that it's doing what it's supposed to do, or we can answer this other question about what it is to take this drug for like 10 years. If we cut the study right now, we won't be able to know that. Do you have an opinion? I mean, this is the sort of thing that I think we can still communicate and
so you have a
ask
version
our
of this.
participants to have. And they have they have
So
something
you
to
have
say.
you have an updated version of the stopping rule.
No, that's
Yeah,
conversation for
okay,
another time.
yeah.
Yes, thank you.
I have. I wanted to ask a question to Mustafa. You spoke about the terrorism and how the government should respond to this kind of terrorist. If I can draw an analogy to the Indian situation, there are two ethnic sites of two ethnic terrorism in the Indian subcontinent. One is in the Kashmir and the other is the Northeast, and I'm from the Northeast, so I have experienced some of that. One of the problems in the reform-based response is often these reforms don't work. You set up these reforms. The typical response of the government is, let's talk to a terrorist group and hash out some kind of reform and sign a treaty, accord. After some time, it turns out it is almost impossible to implement these reforms. The Northeast, in the context, the typical problem is the population of the Northeast, they speak a different language, but they have a large number of Bangladeshi immigrants moving into their space, so they're marginalized and being reduced to minority in their caste. But it is almost, so the government signed an accord with them saying that we'll deport these people. Turns out it is almost impossible to distinguish who is who. They look alike, the culture is similar, they eat the same food, you can never figure out who is who. So after some time, the violence breaks out again, because somehow it turns out that you just cannot stop these things by bringing in a reform. So what do you do in that kind of typical situations? It is a very typical situation.
Yeah, so,
Same in Kashmir.
the term for this, the typical, you said, because, in social sciences, if there's a pattern, you need to come with, of course, with some explanations. And we use the term intractable ethnic conflicts. So, how to deal with this? There is a big literature on conflict resolution, and I really like the emerging literature under the umbrella of conflict transformation. Instead of that, cost-benefit calculations to resolve the issue, that type of logic, especially in Cold War years, it was predominantly it was a predominant approach. Now we do have a new terminology in conflict transformation literature. So is there any answer? Of course, this is not something that could be resolved in few years or even few decades, because these are rooted in historical tensions between these groups. But there are some kind of useful approaches, such as civil diplomacy. That term, you do have these two different segments of the society engaged in different ways to have your plus, if you will. I mean, each terms. If you do have such different societies, you do have culture issue, starting with language. And the other things, as you just mentioned, in everyday life interaction and having the same of consumption patterns and other things. If you have more and more plus in each of these dimensions, you are indeed making a civil repair, what Jeffrey Alexander calls. The civil repair would bring you, more and more platforms, and government, and the other groups right here are as it seems are the only players, but it is not the case. So you need to recognize that there are some other players, major players in the game, and if you have less violence over time, you do have making more constructive civil spheres for these players to emerge and then get engaged, so that it would be easy for government or some other institutions playing the game and negotiating with these armed groups.
Is there someone else? Sorry,
No. You have the last.
Just a couple of questions to you, Mustafa. I think it could be epistemologically problematic to say you have two societies, because here what you're dealing with is a state and a community, a part of the population that on the one hand has aspirations to be identified by kind of a different cultural identity, or perhaps to create a space for its own cultural and identity within the state. Because of course there's a segment of the Kurds that is not interested in integrating Turkey. They want Kurdistan, right? It's a different thing. But I think also so I think saying there are two different societies risks, giving credence to kind of the worst accusations of kind of the peace and conflict resolution stuff. Of course, everybody wants peace, but you have power differentials. You have a very serious one in this case. But I think the explanation could be where you talked about the AKP's possible weakness, the nationalist criticism of the AKP, or that the other scenario was the democratization of Turkey. I think there's a third one that I didn't hear you discuss, which is the whole notion of neo-Ottomanism, that if the AKP is truly built on an ideology of neo-Ottomanism, Ottomanism was much more tolerant of minorities than Turkish nationalism, republicanism, which is very nationalistic, but also very assimilationist, right? And so the kind of the AKP's brand of national Islamism is much more accommodationist than assimilationist. And so that then you could interpret this as a position of strength and as a manifestation of performing this strength, right? Because if you look back in history, the famous Ottoman reforms, the Tanzimat, that's what began identifying Ottoman subjects by their ethnic affiliation. It used to be you had peasants and you had feudal lords. Suddenly, in Lebanon you had the Christians and the Muslims and the Druze, and in Syria you had the Alawis, and of course the Alevis in Turkey. So could all of this be interpreted as a way for the AKP, the party in government, to be performing its own ideology and its own identity to its opponents, as opposed to just a sign of weakness or a general symptom of a more democratizing public life, because there are counter symptoms. There are symptoms that Turkish public life is not democratizing, but rather that democracy is retrenching, right? Depending what you focus on. If you focus on freedom of the press, there's less democracy. If you focus on the kind of the muzzling of the military, there's more democracy. So I'm just wondering what you think of this. And if
It's
part
a
of
great
the-
comment, and absolutely it would work among Kurdish population. I'm now, working on these subjects about new notions of Kurdish Islamic sphere, and we will have a special issue in Journal of Sociology of Islam. I will be editing that issue. So it's a, it's a, wonderful discourse to follow for the government among Kurds. But the main challenge is AKP, these global world now, your frames should be really, also engaged with your other frames in the global arena. And when AKP, the party in government, having these, at times, accusations of neo-Ottomanism, they always reject this to gain the Western respect, especially United States and Western, societies' respect for their sincere modern social force, instead of some, Islamists or some form of neo-Ottoman, imperial vision that is accused by the especially nationalist circles, secular nationalist circles in Turkey. So in that sense, there is a big game going on in domestic sphere and the global sphere, and for them to pursue this path among Kurds, they would win. Of course, they would be much more telling to Kurds than some other discourses would tell the Kurds. But at the same time, it would be a bit risky, so they refrain from this discourse. But it's a great comment.
But I mean, do you really think the Turkish government now is worried what Europe and
not
North,
now,
they
from
have
the
respect-
military.
they have the respect of,
Right.
I mean,
Right.
Turkey is a functioning democracy,
Right.
right? Who would want to be part of the EU now when you look at growth rates, when you look at all the
Right.
problems? I mean, the European Union is messed up.
Right.
And you have Turkey with economic growth of more than
So
10%. I
that
don't
is-
think they're
yeah.
worried about
Right. That
you
is
know?
also a reason for disengagement from the EU discourse, because there's no point now to be a
No, the
EU
EU
member.
should be begging Turkey
For
now,
Turkey.
because that would be an economic boost actually for the EU.
Right, yeah.
There's Germany and Turkey now that are functioning economies, basically.
Yeah.
Anyway, but no, it's I thought
I appreciate your
very
comment,
interesting papers, kind of, and I always by default go looking for linkages between them.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
Well, we're over time, so no, that's fine. No, it's fine. No, it's been a great discussion. I want to thank the provost postdocs and Dr. Crady for presenting, and of course to the provost who could not make it for having this too. So thank you all.